The Gulf is on fire. Markets are bracing for stagflation. NATO is arguing over who pays. U.S. and Chinese officials just finished 2 days of talks in Paris. Ukraine is fighting for the world's attention. These are the stories the world is watching. But in this video, I want to take you somewhere different. I want to talk about the stories happening in the background. Not because they're less important, but because the fact that they're in the background is itself a geopolitical fact, a consequential one. We're going to look at what China is doing around Taiwan right now. Not an invasion, not a formal crisis, but something arguably more dangerous, a slow, systematic campaign to normalize military pressure until the concept of Taiwanese sovereignty starts to feel like a matter of routine negotiation rather than an inviolable line. And then we're going to look at Sudan, a country where a drone strike just killed 11 people and injured more than 20, where Doctors Without Borders is still documenting civilian casualties in a conflict that most of the world stopped paying attention to months ago. And I want to ask a harder question. What does it mean geopolitically that some wars are watched and some aren't? Who decides? And what are the consequences? Because attention, it turns out, is not just a media concept. It's a strategic resource, and how it's allocated shapes outcomes in ways we rarely make explicit. Taiwan? When pressure becomes the new normal. On March 15th, Reuters reported that Taiwan detected 26 Chinese military aircraft operating around the island in a single day, the largest burst of activity since late February, following an unusual lull of more than 2 weeks. Now I want to give you 2 ways to read this headline. The first is the obvious one. China is escalating. 26 aircraft is a lot. It's provocative. Taiwan scrambled its own aircraft in response. The situation is tense. That reading isn't wrong, but it's incomplete. The second reading is the one I think matters more strategically. This is a pause and surge pattern. China went quiet for 2 weeks, long enough for regional governments, financial markets, and global media to lower their alert level. Then it surged again, and crucially, nothing changed. No response beyond the routine, no emergency diplomatic meeting, no escalated military posture from the United States or Japan. Life went on. That's the mechanism. Not one massive provocation that triggers a global response, but a pattern of sustained pressure punctuated by brief pauses designed to gradually raise what counts as normal, to shift the baseline, to make 26 aircraft feel like a weather report rather than a crisis. Military strategists call this a gray zone campaign. It operates below the threshold of an act of war, but above the threshold of routine peacetime activity. And its genius, from Beijing's perspective, is that it creates a dilemma for everyone else. If Taiwan and its allies respond to every surge with maximum alarm, they exhaust themselves politically and militarily, and Beijing can point to the overreaction. If they respond with routine calm, China's activities gradually become accepted as part of the regional landscape. Neither response is fully satisfying. That's the point. What's the endgame? Beijing's stated goal is eventual reunification with Taiwan, but the gray zone campaign isn't about conquest in the short term. It's about degrading the psychological and political resistance to Chinese pressure over time. It's about convincing Taiwan's population that the status quo of de facto independence is increasingly expensive to maintain. It's about convincing regional investors and governments that the Taiwan question is perpetually uncertain, not a stable baseline to plan around. There's an additional layer worth noting. Timing. These flights are happening during the Gulf crisis while American military attention and assets are partially focused on the Middle East. China didn't create the Gulf crisis, but experienced strategists in Beijing will have noticed that a distracted adversary is a more advantageous operating environment. The pause and surge on March 15th may not be coincidental. I'm not saying China is planning to move on Taiwan while the U.S. is focused on the Gulf. That kind of opportunism at this scale carries enormous risk, and Beijing's leadership has historically been cautious about military adventures with unpredictable outcomes. But probing, testing response times, measuring Western resolve, conditioning the environment, all of that can happen quietly, in the background, while the world watches fires elsewhere. And speaking of fires that the world stopped watching, let me take you to Sudan. Sudan and the politics of invisibility. On March 13th, Doctors Without Borders reported a drone strike in western Sudan that killed 11 people and injured more than 20 after fuel reserves caught fire following the attack. It was covered in Reuters. It received a fraction of the attention of any single development in the Gulf. I want to sit with that for a moment before we go analytical, because I think the analytical framing can sometimes let us off the hook too easily. 11 people were killed, dozens were injured. Fuel reserves, the kind of infrastructure that keeps a hospital running, that keeps vehicles moving, that keeps a community from complete logistical collapse, caught fire. Doctors Without Borders, one of the most credible humanitarian organizations on the planet, documented it, and the world mostly moved on. Sudan's civil war started in April 2023 when the Sudanese Armed Forces and the Rapid Support Forces, a paramilitary group that grew out of the Janjaweed militias, turned on each other after a failed political transition. The consequences have been catastrophic. Over 12 million people displaced, one of the largest displacement crises in the world, famine conditions spreading across multiple regions, aid organizations unable to operate safely in vast stretches of the country. And the world is not watching, not really, not with the sustained political will that would translate into pressure, resources, or accountability. Why? Let me give you the honest answer, which is somewhat uncomfortable. Sudan doesn't move oil prices. It doesn't sit astride a critical shipping lane. It doesn't have a nuclear program. Its major power patrons, the UAE and Russia, among others, have backed different factions for their own reasons, have not escalated the conflict to the point where it threatens the interests of countries with Security Council vetoes in a way they can't manage. In the brutal calculus of global attention, Sudan doesn't have enough strategic leverage to force the world to prioritize it, and so it doesn't get prioritized. The suffering continues, the displacement deepens, the famine expands, and every month that the Gulf dominates headlines, the Sudanese crisis gets a little easier for the world to ignore. There's a word for this in humanitarian policy circles, compassion fatigue, but I want to push back on that framing slightly because compassion fatigue implies that the inattention is involuntary, that we simply ran out of emotional capacity. I think it's more precise to say it's structural. The global attention system, media, diplomatic resources, aid budgets, political will, allocates itself according to strategic interest, not suffering magnitude. And that allocation has consequences. When a crisis is ignored long enough, it becomes self-perpetuating. Donor funding dries up. Aid workers leave because conditions are too dangerous. The conflict parties have less incentive to negotiate because there's no external pressure. Regional instability spreads. Chad, Central African Republic, Ethiopia are all affected by Sudanese displacement flows. And eventually, a forgotten conflict creates a failed state. And failed states create the conditions for the next generation of crises that the world will eventually have to pay attention to, usually after they've already become catastrophic. So Sudan isn't just a humanitarian story, it's a preview of what happens when strategic indifference is allowed to compound. The cost of watching isn't zero, but the cost of not watching eventually becomes unmistakable, which brings me to the broader argument I want to make to close this series: attention as a geopolitical weapon. Let me make an argument I don't think gets made often enough. Attention, the sustained organized attention of governments, media, markets, and publics, is a geopolitical resource. And like all resources, it can be accumulated, deployed, contested, and weaponized. Think about what we've covered across these 3 videos. The Gulf crisis is consuming enormous amounts of global attention right now. That attention has consequences everywhere else. Ukraine's leverage erodes when coverage shifts. Sudan's crisis deepens when the media cycle moves on. China's gray zone campaign around Taiwan becomes marginally safer to run when American military and political attention is partially occupied elsewhere. European governments have less political bandwidth to press hard on Russian sanctions enforcement when their own publics are worried about energy costs. None of these are accidents. Some are coincidences. Some are opportunism. Some are deliberate strategy. But the pattern is real. The proliferation of simultaneous crises strains the attention system, and the actors who benefit most are the ones who understand how to operate in the gaps. Russia has understood this for years. It was operating in Syria, Libya, Mali, and Ukraine simultaneously, not because it had the military capacity to win everywhere, but because spreading attention is a force multiplier. If the West is watching 5 places, it's watching each one with 1/5 of the focus. China is learning from this, or perhaps developing its own version. The gray zone campaign around Taiwan is partly about Taiwan. It's also partly about demonstrating that China can apply sustained pressure across a long time horizon while the U.S. is preoccupied elsewhere, and that the response will be incomplete and exhausting. And non-state actors understand this too. The decision to target Dubai International Airport and Baghdad Airport in the same week isn't just about military damage. It's about saturating the news cycle, overwhelming diplomatic bandwidth, and creating a sense of omnipresent threat that is harder to defend against than a single concentrated attack. What does this mean for how we should think about geopolitics? I think it means that the standard framework, looking at individual crises in isolation, evaluating each one on its own terms, systematically misses something important. The question isn't just what's happening in the Gulf or in Taiwan or in Sudan. The question is what it means for all of them to be happening simultaneously and who benefits from the combination. So let me close this series with what I think is the most important single observation from everything we've covered. the single most important observation. Over these 3 videos, we've covered Gulf strikes and military deployments and historic oil supply disruption, the economic threat of stagflation, great power negotiations in Paris, Ukraine's battle for attention and leverage, NATO's internal fault lines over Hormuz, China's normalization campaign around Taiwan, and Sudan's catastrophic invisible war. 10 stories, 10 different geographies, 10 different actors. But I want to argue they're all illuminating the same underlying reality. We are living through a stress test of the global order, and the results are not entirely reassuring. The institutions and alliances that were supposed to manage global crises, the IEA, NATO, the UN Security Council, Western sanctions regimes, U.S. bilateral security commitments, are all functional. None of them have collapsed, but all of them are being operated under conditions they were not fully designed for. Simultaneous, overlapping, interconnected crises in which the trade-offs between managing one problem and another are becoming acute. The most important single observation from all of this is not about any one crisis, it's about bandwidth. The global order has finite capacity to manage problems simultaneously, and right now that capacity is being tested more severely than at any point since the end of the Cold War. How the major institutions and alliances perform under this pressure will shape the next decade of geopolitics. Watch which commitments hold and which ones quietly soften. Watch which conflicts get managed and which get abandoned. Watch which alliances deepen under pressure and which ones start sending each other invoices, because that's where the real story is. Not in the individual headlines, those change every day, but in the pattern underneath them, in what the system can handle and what it can't. I hope these 3 videos gave you a framework for thinking about that. If they did, subscribe, because this is the kind of analysis I'm going to keep making every week as the world keeps getting more complicated. I'll see you in the next one.